last time we left off, and I had you do this problem on your own, your A was 2, your B was -8, and your C was 1. Hopefully your work looks something like mine. The only part that was different than anything we had done before is when we got to the square root part here. Square root of 56 is not nice and pretty. It's about 7.48. So type that in your calculator. Remember I said I like about 2 decimals. And then you have your 2 options. You can do 8 plus that estimation or 8 minus that estimation. So my 2 solutions are 3.87 and about 0.13. And again, you could still check these. Chances are you won't get exactly 0, but you'll get pretty darn close to 0. Or you could always plug it in your graphing calculator and do the nice little trace thing that we've done in the past. So now that we know how to use the quadratic formula, let's talk about something that goes along with the quadratic formula. It's something called the discriminant. Discriminant. So if a quadratic equation is in standard form, the discriminant of a quadratic equation is b squared minus 4ac. That should look familiar because that's all the stuff underneath the square root of our quadratic formula. Remember, if you write it down a million times, it will stick in your head. So the discriminant is just the stuff underneath the square root. It doesn't include the square root, just all the stuff underneath of it. So let's say that our equation is this one right here. We can use the discriminant to figure out how many solutions we're going to have. So we're not figuring out what the solutions are, we're just seeing if it has solutions. So sometimes this is helpful if you get something maybe you can't factor, maybe you're unsure of how you did the quadratic formula. You can use the discriminant test to show if it has solutions. So if we use this equation right here, plug it into just the discriminant, b squared minus 4ac, we end up with a positive number. Think back to the quadratic formula. If you get a positive number in here, that means you can take the square root of it. And when you take the square root of it, you're going to get like b plus or minus a number, and then divide it over 2a. So then you'd split it up into option number 1 and then option number 2. So that means if this is positive, you're going to have 2 solutions. And if we graph this equation, we can easily see that we have 2 solutions here. If we do the next one, let's say we plug it into here, and we do b squared minus 4ac, and we get 0 out. Something a little different happens. If we have 0 in here, we have negative b plus or minus the square root of 0. Square root of 0 is just 0. So if I have negative b plus or minus 0, is that going to change b at all? If I add 0, it's going to stay the same. If I subtract 0, it's going to stay the same. So we really just end up with b over 2a. Only one option. So if you get 0 for your discriminant, basically the square root part isn't going to change anything. So you're only going to have one solution. And those are the ones that just come and touch the x-axis and then shoot back up. Our third option is if you get a negative number. So we have positive, 0, and then negative. If you plug in your a, your b, and your c, and your discriminant is negative, so if you get a negative number underneath the square root, you would end up with negative b plus or minus a negative number. And we know that we cannot take the square root of a negative number. So that means I can't find any solutions. I can't do the square root part, so I can't do plus or minus negative b, and I certainly can't divide it by 2a. So if you get a negative number, there's no possibilities, no real numbers. And it's one of those graphs that just never touches the x-axis. So the discriminant's pretty cool. We're not actually finding the solutions, we're just figuring out how many there are. So let's do some problems where we just figure out how many solutions there is. So the discriminant, remember, is just b squared minus 4ac. So this very first one, I have a is 3, b is 10, and c is 2. So let's plug those in. I have 10 squared minus 4 times 3 times 2. So I get 100 minus 4 times 3 will give me 12. Times that by 2, I get minus 24. When we do that math, we get 76. Positive number. 76 is not your answer. We can't have 76 solutions. But because this is positive, we know we have 2 solutions. It's going to cross the graph twice. We're going to take the square root of 76 and then be able to split up our equation into 2 different options. Let's skip B and let's do C. You can do B on your own. For C, your A is 1, your B is 1, and your C is 1. So plug them in. B squared minus 4 times 1 times 1. So I get 1 minus 4 gives me a negative 3. So remember, negative 3 is not your answer. It's just telling you that since it's negative, I can't take the square root of it, and it has no solutions. This would be a graph that never crosses the x-axis. So pause the video, try B on your own. Hopefully you know that it's going to be only one solution because we've done one of all the other ones. But plug it in and make sure that you can get the correct value out. So when you plug this in, you should have gotten 36 minus 36, and that obviously equals 0. One mistake you should not make is this does not mean you have 0 solutions. It means because you are going to take the square root of 0, you're not going to have 2 options. You're only going to have negative b over 2a, so that means you have 1 solution. Let's do a story problem, and then we'll wrap everything up, the whole chapter. So a weight 1 foot above the ground on a carnival strength test is shot straight up with an initial velocity of 35 feet per second. Will it ring the bell at the top of the pole? So we want it to go all the way up to 20 feet. Use the discriminant to explain your answer. So let's plug in the values that they gave us. V stands for velocity, and remember C stands for our starting point. So we have our height equals negative 16t plus our velocity, which is 35t, plus how high it starts off the ground at 1. The h on the left side is how high we want it to go. So we want it to go up to 20. Now this problem said use the discriminant to explain our answer. So if we use the discriminant and get a negative number, that means that there are no solutions. That means that there's no value that I can plug in for t to make it go up to 20. If we get 0 out, that means there's only 1 possibility for t, but we can still get 20. And if we find that the discriminant is positive, that means that there's 2 possibilities for the amount of time that it's in the air. So in order to use the discriminant, remember it has to be in standard form. That means it has to equal 0. So I want to subtract 20 from both sides. So now I have 0 equals negative 16t squared plus 35t minus 19. So now we're going to plug these numbers into our discriminant formula. So here's A, B is 35, and C is negative 19. So we have B squared, 35 squared, minus 4 times negative 16 times negative 19. So big numbers, break out your calculator. 35 squared is 1225. If I do negative 4 times negative 16 times negative 19, I end up with negative 1216. So if we subtract these two, we end up with nine. We get a positive number. So because it's a positive number, this does not mean that our answer is 9. It means that there are solutions. And because there is solutions, it will reach the top of the pole. there is a possibility of a number to plug in for t here and here that will let it get up to this 20 feet. So the answer to the question, will it ring the bell? Yes, because there are solutions. Alright, so let's talk about all the different methods we have used. First one we did was graphing. No, it's kind of pointless, but some advantages are it works to give approximate solutions, and you can quickly see the number of solutions. So if you type it in your graphing calculator, you can see very quickly that it has 1, 2, or 0 solutions. Disadvantages are what we found. You can't always get an exact solution, especially if you're not using a calculator. Factoring is what we did next. That was old news. It's good to try first because it's super easy if you can factor. But sometimes it can't be factored, and sometimes the factoring is crazy, like if you have giant numbers. Square roots was the next one. This is awesome if it has no x term. Remember, your b has to be 0. And you can't use it when there is an x term. It doesn't work. The next two, completing the square and the quadratic formula, definitely the toughest, but they always work. Completing the square can sometimes involve really difficult calculations, like especially when you cut the number in half and you square it and it's a decimal. The quadratic formula always works, but it takes a lot of time, like you saw, and there's tons of room for mistakes. So sometimes you'll be asked to specifically solve one way. That's the way I need to see, that's the way you have to do it. You can always check it other ways, but if I tell you to solve by graphing, I better see a quadratic graph. If you're just told to solve, you get to pick. I always try factoring first. If that doesn't work, then I use the quadratic formula. Not really a huge fan of completing the square, just because I always forget about doing that, because the quadratic formula is so stuck in my head. So, this is it. Have a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday.